On the show this week, the evolution of sperm and the finding that sperm actually originated before animal life as we know it.
Could say that we are all sperm that have evolved an extra life stage where we have a multicellular body.
You could say that. Probably no one else will ever say that.
We're also revealing that the brain ages in 5 distinct stages.
Nice.
This was a really intriguing study, especially because it suggests that adolescence may actually extend into our early 30s, which could explain why some days I do feel like a teenager.
We're also reporting from the National Emergency Briefing in London I've just come from. That's set up to alert people to the escalating threats to society and to the world in general from the climate crisis.
They really emphasise the connections between things, connected to our health, to our security, biodiversity, the economy, all these things are connected.
Welcome to The World, the Universe and Us from New Scientist. I'm Dr. Penny Sarshay.
And I'm Dr. Rowan Hooper.
So shall we talk about sperm then?
Yeah. So about the origin of sperm, the evolutionary origin. Now, as you know, there's this concept in genetics and origin of life studies called the last universal common ancestor.
Yeah, also known as LUCA. That's the single-celled organism that all of life today theoretically traces back to and doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
We'll never find it, but we can try to reconstruct it. We can look at genes, work out what it must have looked like. Are you going to say that we can do that for sperm?
Well, that's it. That's today's story. The last universal common sperm is the story.
Great.
And so if we can give it an acronym, the last universal common ancestor of sperm, or LUCAS.
LUCAS.
Yeah, is the name. Sam Wong's here to talk about it. Sam, how do we recreate LUCAS?
Well, we can look at the proteins that make up sperm in living animals, and we can look at the genes that code for those proteins and work out how they're all related. And from that, we can deduce what the ancestor of all those sperm looked like and also work out when that ancestor lived. And that's what Arthur Matt at the University of Cambridge and his colleagues have done in a study that we reported on this week.
So the sperm toolkit then, tell us about what it is and what it suggests about sperm's origins and this intriguing suggestion that it predates animals.
So there's a toolkit of around 300 gene families in living animals, they're widespread in animals today, but they're not only found in animals, they're also present in some single-celled eukaryotic organisms that are related to animals, like choanoflagellates, they look quite like a sperm actually, so maybe it's not that surprising, but they have a swimming tail called the flagellum, and the protein toolkit that they use is very similar to the toolkit in sperm. So that suggests that we've inherited the molecular machinery of sperm from a single-celled ancestor that predates all animals. You could say that we are all sperm that have evolved an extra life stage where we have a multicellular body.
You could say that, but probably no one else will ever say that.
You are a sperm. It's uncomfortable
It's
fact.
one of these stories that when you first told me about it, it just made complete sense. That there would be pre-existing parts that are clobbered together like a kind of Frankensperm to make something. Of course, it's not going to just leap out of nothing. But sperm are incredibly diverse in shape, aren't they? And I did work on them a bit in my PhD on sperm variety and diversity. But this study, Sam, it showed that the innovations that led to all this diversity in modern sperm that we see, they've mostly been on the head of the sperm, and the tail hasn't really changed much since that common ancestor.
Yeah, that's right. So sperm have evolved a lot, as you say. They have to work in lots of different environments. So, for example, the sperm have to find an egg inside a body, whereas lots of animals, the sperm is sort of free swimming in the ocean or in other bodies of water. So they're working in different environments. They need to have different specializations for that. But yeah, most of that change has happened in the head, whereas all sperm have to swim. So they all have this kind of swimming tail, and that bit is really conserved. It hasn't changed very much throughout the course of evolutionary history.
I am actually quite surprised that we didn't know this already, because this is something that I wondered about years ago, first learning about, like you say, single-celled eukaryotes, like complex cells, often have these flagellae, and they're so like sperm. Structurally, they're very, very similar. But now we're only really now kind of making that link in the research.
Yeah, that's right. I think people, I don't know why, but somehow they hadn't really put it all together.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does make sense.
I think there'd been a sort of anatomical link, but this is a genetic link now,
to kind of underpin that.
Yeah.
And I hate to be that person who always talks about plants. But that idea you suggested that we're all sperm really, and we've just kind of got this add-on stage where we're multicellular. Early plants were like that too. Originally, it was the sex cells that were the dominant part of the life cycle, and then they just spun off this tiny little phase where they happen to not be sex cells. So it's quite interesting to think that that's at the core of being a eukaryote.
Yeah.
Anyway, any good sperm anecdotes from your PhD?
Well, how long have
Rowan?
we got, actually? But talking about the tail, there are some species where the sperm join together, so they have twin access to double power to swim. That's in some mammals. Opossums have the sperm twin together.
Little buddies.
Yeah, but then they turn to enemies at the end, right?
Wow.
Because only one can fertilize the egg. So
Interesting.
And then some of my favourite sperm. Just as I was saying, it sounds a bit strange.
Not a great phrase, yeah.
But if you work on this stuff, so the great water beetle, Dytiscus, that's got giant sperm. I remember dissecting it once and looking at the sperm storage.
How big are we
organ.
talking?
Well, so the beetles are, about a centimetre long.
Yeah.
And the sperm, it comes out like spaghetti out of the thing, really long, like it probably over a centimetre long. So it comes out, it's huge in this insect. So it's got giant sperm. And then Lepidoptera, of course, most of the ejaculate has no DNA in it.
By which we mean, we're talking butterfly and moths now.
Yeah. Most of them, half the sperm have no DNA.
So what's the point of it
So
then?
it's a whole huge mystery, which we...
Really?
Yeah. It's a really interesting evolutionary mystery. What is that anucleate sperm for? So we can't get into that now. But what we can get into is something that really has bothered me for ages, this basically ridiculous situation that male mammals have got themselves in, that the testes are housed outside the body. So, these are, in an evolutionary sense, the most important thing that we have, right? And we don't have, our brain is in a nice protective skull.
Yeah.
The testes are just hanging in a sack, so vulnerable, it's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous, but I guess it works. And one of the ideas is that to make sperm, you need cooler temperatures, and that's more durable if they're outside of the
but that's
rest
always
of the
the
body.
story. But it just never made sense to me. But Sam has... I know you've got a good understanding of all this, so take us through it.
Well, so as you say, it leaves us quite vulnerable to injury, and it's not the case for all animals. So fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, they all don't have scrotums, and even in mammals, it's only mammals that have scrotums, but lots of mammals don't have them. So there must be some reason why it's so widespread in mammals. Why does the sperm have to develop at a cooler temperature? So if we look at the evolution, it looks like scrotums evolved twice in mammals. In marsupials, the males have scrotums, but they hang in front of the penis, so it looks really bizarre if you ever see a kangaroo's genitals. And in our branch of the mammal tree, there are some animals that had a scrotal ancestor, and then they evolved back to not having a scrotum. So whales and dolphins, obviously, if you're in the water, it makes sense to not have a scrotum. But also elephants, rhinos, hippos, hedgehogs. So all of these animals have gone back to not having a scrotum, and we're not really sure why. So why are there these differences? So scrotality has evolved twice, to use the technical word, and it's persisted in most mammals. There must be a good reason for it. The first proposed explanation is that sperm development needs to happen at a lower temperature, and there's lots of evidence for this. There were some experiments in the 1890s where some poor dogs had their balls pushed into their abdomens and sewn up, and the sperm basically stopped developing. And then in men now, we see that there's a link between wearing tight pants and lower sperm counts, or less viable sperm.
Yeah.
And there is a lower temperature in the testes as well.
Yes, that's right. It's considerably colder. But that raises the question why sperm development evolved to need a lower temperature. So warm-bloodedness evolved about 100 million years before the scrotum, so having warm balls wasn't always a problem. So there are a few possible explanations. No, we still don't know which one is really correct, but one idea is the display hypothesis, which is saying that external genitals are important for attracting a mate, and that fits with this idea in evolutionary biology called the
honest signaling.
Honest signaling, that's right. So Amot Zahavi proposed that males have these costly ornaments like the peacock's tail or whatever that are they're an honest signal because they're so inconvenient. It shows that you must be a fit and healthy male if you can carry around these ornaments. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because scrotums are not that conspicuous in most animals,
unless you're a vervet monkey. And they've got a bright blue scrotum, and I think it's the higher ranking male males have the brightest balls, and when they go down in rank, unfortunately the colour turns down. So that is definitely that's an honest signal of status. You just look at the ball colour of these monkeys.
Yeah,
but as you say, it's not a universal explanation.
For those of us who don't have bright blue balls, there must be some other explanation.
Moving swiftly on.
So there was an idea put forward by a guy called Michael Chance in the 90s. I found a New Scientist article about this. He read in the newspaper after the Oxford and Cambridge boat race that the rowers' urine contained prostate fluid, apparently because the exertions of rowing raised the pressure inside the abdomen and squeezed out some of this prostate fluid. There's no sphincters in the reproductive tract to keep stuff in. So he said, well, if the testes were inside the body, then when you were doing running or rowing or whatever, then it would be squeezing out the sperm, and that would be a waste of sperm. So he looked across all of the animals, and he found that the ones that have a scrotum are the ones that have to do a lot of leaping or galloping, and it's these kind of really high energy movements that would raise the pressure in the abdomen and would be forcing out the fluid, and therefore they need to have the balls on the outside, because it avoids this pressure problem. So that's an interesting idea, kind of appealing. But then you think, well, why don't we just have a sphincter that keeps the reproductive tract closed and stops things from
and
getting squeezed out?
also, not all of us exert ourselves like we're in the boat race all the time. And so in order for that possibility, we have to have a scrotum all the rest of the time, and all the dangers that involves.
What was the starting hypothesis? I'm just going to collect the urine off a bunch of rowers after.
I don't know. I think that was an unrelated study that he just happened to see that there was results.
But about the evolution of a reproductive sphincter, I was thinking about this about the penis bone, because we used to, or when I say we, like humans used to have a penis bone.
Chimpanzees still do.
Chimps still do.
It's quite widespread in mammals.
But we lost ours. So maybe there's something in that. I think in that. The lack of a penis bone in humans is probably another honest signal, because it means you can't fake an erection. But that is the explanation.
Sleep marmalade. Sorry, Sam. Go on.
I've lost my train of thought.
Speechless.
I'm just wondering. Well, so are you suggesting that chimpanzees do fake an erection? And what does
they
that,
do
what does
fake
that mean?
it. They just run around with an erection.
But is that fake? Is that surely that's a real erection?
No, it's not a sign of quality. Because
right.
Whereas
yes. Should we do a special episode on penis bone?
Yes, please.
Later on. Yeah, maybe a bonus further down the line.
Time for a word from our sponsors, Deep. What's it like to really live on the ocean floor? Head over to the New Scientist Collab podcasts to journey to Vanguard, a next-generation subsea habitat where you can crawl through hatches like a space station, have giant fish as nosy neighbours, and become a real aquanaut. Discover the future of ocean exploration at New Scientist Collab podcasts, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Many of us feel like we go through phases in our life. Right now, I'm in my podcasting era. But seriously.
But Taylor Swift. Eras.
Yeah, exactly. We'll get to that in a sec. But in seriousness, research is beginning to show that often when we feel like we've passed through into some other kind of a stage of life, or we've aged somewhat rapidly, it's starting to look like this could also be true on a biological level. And there are these multiple dramatic physiological changes that occur throughout our lifetimes. This week, a new study has suggested that there are 4 major turning points in how our brains are wired throughout our lives. And health reporter Carissa Wong is here to tell us more.
Yeah, this was a really intriguing study, especially because it suggests that adolescence may actually extend into our early 30s, which could explain why some days I do feel like a teenager. But first, it's helpful to understand kind of how the brain is organised. So the brain has many distinct regions, which are each involved in a specific task like memory or learning a language, those sort of things. And these various brain regions talk to each other through these wiry structures called white matter tracts, which essentially pass information from one region to another, allowing the brain to sort of act as a whole. And it's this wiring that's really crucial for like putting together our personalities and our cognitive abilities.
Wow. And so this wiring itself changes with age, these connections. I mean, the tracts between the areas changes with age.
Yes. So researchers analysed MRI brain scans from about 3,800 people from the UK and US, and they were aged between birth and 90 years old. And none of them, or mostly none of them, had neurodegenerative conditions or any mental health conditions.
Right.
And what they found is that the brain's wiring seems to go through 4 key turning points, and these are at age 9, 32, 66, and 83.
That's specific, isn't it?
Yeah, let's probe that in a minute.
Okay.
So the first phase occurs between birth and 9 years old. And during this phase, the brain's sort of connections between brain regions seems to become a bit longer and convoluted. So in a way, a bit less efficient.
So I think we already knew that like brain growth is incredibly rapid in children, especially like those first 3 years. But what does it mean if those connections are more convoluted? Does it mean it's like information being sent across the brain? It's taking longer? It's taking a more circuitous path?
Exactly. So that's what we mean by it gets less efficient in that era.
Wow.
And so why do we think that happens?
So as you just mentioned, in our very early years, we do have like this proliferation of connections between neurons in infant brains. And then as they age through to about age 6, 7 or so, some of those connections are pruned off. As we experience things and grow, like our useful ones are reinforced and the ones that aren't so useful are sort of removed.
I'm really interested in this, just to interject, because it's sometimes talked to us about as like a pre-adolescence or a secret puberty. And it's not often talked about, but there's a real change that happens in children at that age. And Alison Gopnik, the really famous developmental psychologist, I read a phrase of her, and I'm sure I misquoted it, but once she sort of described like there's no one on earth more serious than a 6 or 7-year-old. And it's because they're going through this kind of change at that time.
Yes, exactly. And so this process creates a really nice broad range of useful connections, helping you learn things like languages or how to play the piano. But it seems that the side effect of this is that, you get a less efficient wiring in the brain.
Wow. So I have a child about to turn 9. What happens at this age?
Yes, so around age 9, this is the beginning of the next phase, and researchers think that this might be triggered by puberty, so like hormonal changes happening that can affect how the brain develops. But it could also just be that thing of, the pruning process that is so crucial in those early years, sort of winding down and pushing you towards this new phase. And the next phase is essentially from age 9 to 32. And that's sort of where you have an increase in the efficiency of the connections between brain regions.
I mean, this is bonkers, isn't it? 9 to 32. If you compare your daughter with, not making assumptions about your age, but you said you still feel like a teenager, so early 30s, like so many changes are happening within us, to us during this time period. The idea that that's a sort of fixed term of cognitive development is quite out there.
Yeah, so they're not saying that between age 9 and 15 and 25 we all have the same brain.
Yeah.
It's specifically when you're looking at this very general sort of picture of the brain's wiring that you see this same pattern of increasing efficiency. And so that's why the researchers sort of lump them together in a phase.
Okay, so it's a population level look at, and that's why you get these sorts of patterns. But so you go from getting as many useful connections as you can in phase 1 and then to pruning, making those connections more efficient. But the second phase, does that imply that adolescence, is this what you're saying, that adolescence, this phase, this transition, lasts really that long? I mean, if the brain's still really increasing its efficiency even into your 30s?
That is one way you could think about it. As I mentioned, it's a phase from 9 to 32, and adolescence is that transition from childhood to adulthood. So, yes, maybe you could conclude that. But it's important to remember that the way we define adolescence is going to differ depending on what measures you're looking at.
Yeah, so I want to bang the drum for grey matter here because this is about white matter.
Okay.
And I saw a lot of places this week have kind of run with the idea that, we're adolescents into our 30s. And I think that chimes that I get, possibly because I'm in my 30s, I get a lot of jokes on social media about like, I have a career and a house, but I just feel like a teenager. So I think we all want to believe it, right? But if we think about grey matter, which is the bodies of neurons, they connect together, also really important. We know that in adolescents, there's this extensive pruning of grey matter. It like after all of this proliferation in your childhood, it's the time to really boost efficiency, which it sounds like it's the same with white matter. But the grey matter remodelling is amazing. It goes from the back of the brain and then works its way forward. And we've known for a little while now that the last bit to get remodels is the prefrontal cortex, where we make good decisions, but that gets done by about the early 20s. So, okay, maybe by white matter measures, we're still teenagers into our 30s, but we should be able to make better decisions and behave like grown-ups in our 20s.
No, you can't lean on this result to say that's why I was an arsehole.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I still think it's really interesting, though, to kind of get this view, and often we don't talk about white matter. And so what's the next one then, Carissa? 32, what happens at that point?
So from 32 to 66, we see this efficiency trend sort of flip back to decreasing over time.
Is there a crumb of comfort for someone who may not be in their 30s anymore?
Yeah, so while there is some decreasing efficiency, it's actually very gradual. So the changes that happen in this really long phase, the longest of all the phases, are very subtle, actually. So you could sort of think it as like a stable phase, which is a bit nicer, right?
Yeah.
Then you hit the next phase, which runs from 66 to 83. And during this period, it kind of seems like the brain seems to like maintain the connections between neurons within regions, but the connections between different regions seems to sort of weaken relatively to that. And that's quite interesting because like around this age, you get more risk of things like Alzheimer's, dementia. And so while we don't really know from this study exactly how this links the brain wiring to those conditions, it is certainly interesting to see a difference here.
Yeah, it's intriguing to see that correlation, isn't it? Because the risk for dementia really does go up at around this time, that with this transition. And then what's the phase that comes in after 83 then?
So from 83 to 90, because 90 was the oldest participants that they had in this study, they see a general weakening of connections between brain regions. But also this interesting thing happens where the connections are going through these hub regions more. So it's like as you wear and tear and you age, your brain is being very careful with where it puts its resources. And it seems to find it more efficient, basically, to make connections run through certain fewer regions rather than maintaining them broadly everywhere.
You don't want to overinterpret it, but like I do feel like you can almost imagine what that's like when you're younger, everything's sparking and it all connects up, and then as you're older, if you're really tired, you kind of have to force the information through these key hubs, and that's sort of slower, but you don't know if that's what we're really experiencing, do you?
No.
And what about after 90, though? Is there any ideas about that? I know that this study stopped at 90, but what about what happens after that?
Yeah, I did ask the researcher about this, and she said, anything could happen really after that. It could be a new phase, it could be a golden era, who knows? But they didn't have data to explain that. It could also be that the last phase we described just continues.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we've got some really specific numbers here, 66, 83, but this is all from averages. Like, how generalizable are these really? Do we all fit into these neat categories? They almost feel like horoscopes, right? We just kind of, that's who I am. But are we all going through these defined same number of phases?
That's a really important point. So this study is like averaging people across a population. And so for a certain individual, I asked the researcher, could you have one era, 2 eras, like 15 eras? And she was like, well, it's possible. We don't know how far that ranges between people. And it's also important to note that not everyone is going to hit these phases at the same time. So some people might hit a phase earlier or later. We need to look more into that.
I guess we write a lot in New Scientist about things you can do to slow your brain aging
or
boost your cognitive reserve. So that suggests that, this isn't destiny. You can get beyond.
Yeah. Is there any idea about that? Because if you can find people who can delay the decrease in efficiency of their brains, maybe we can learn something about that and then apply it to the rest of us.
Exactly. So this is why it's so interesting to see how these phases change over time, how it links to cognitive function and health, and how it differs between people. The idea is that if we understand what's driving those changes, whether it's environmental exposures or genetics or something else, we can start to pinpoint exactly maybe ways that we can sort of alter these things. And if you compare sort of the average healthy brain aging to conditions like mental health or neurodegenerative disease, you might be able to find out as well, like how your brain wiring might be changing, sort of your risk of those conditions.
I saw in your article, Carissa, that you note that some of these sort of tipping points or turning points do correlate with key things that we know happen with the brain. So like we've already said, dementia at around 65, 66, but also many mental health conditions are usually clear by the time you're 25, say.
Exactly. So this kind of information can help us understand why is it that certain phases of life seem to put us at greater risk of certain conditions, as you say, like mental illness. But one thing to be wary of is that these studies were based on people in the UK and US, and the participants were also mainly white. And it is important that we look at a more ethnically and geographically diverse range of people when we sort of want to make these general assumptions about how our brains are wiring.
Now, on Thursday morning, I attended the National Emergency Briefing in London, and this is an initiative set up by climate activists and funders and scientists, and they've invited like 10 world-leading experts across a range of subjects: climate, weather, food security, health, and so on, and economists as well were there. And each one gave a short presentation on the state of the world. And the message across the board is that the environmental breakdown is biting harder. It's escalating faster than expected. And it was very powerfully put, because these people were not your normal sort of activists that you might see, with a woolly hat on, waving a flag, or these are world experts. There was this guy, Hugh Montgomery. He's a professor of intensive care medicine at UCL. He's professor of emergencies, and he showed images of his emergency room. He said, I deal in emergencies. That's what I do. We are in an emergency, and we have to treat it as such. And he referred to this Lancet report showing that the biggest health risk of the 21st century is climate change. And about the future, he said it's no longer about risk, it's about survival. So it becomes very stark, the way they were talking about it. Michael LePage was with me at the meeting. Michael, what were your takeaways?
I think the meeting had a really powerful effect on me. There's no single thing that people said that was new that I didn't know about or that we haven't reported on, but having a series of talks lay it out in such sort of clear, stark terms, one after the other, was really powerful. So, for instance, we had Kevin Anderson at the University of Manchester warning that there's a small but real chance of a 4 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, which would have all sorts of devastating consequences and probably lead to societal collapse. We had Tim Lenton at Exeter talking about tipping points and how if the Atlantic overturning circulation collapses, that would lead to consequences that include these really severe winters in the UK where the temperatures in London will go down to -20. The North Sea would freeze over.
Well, he showed the ice sheet, how it goes down all as far as south as the Wash in the UK. The Arctic ice sheet just extends that far south.
Just incredible. Yeah. And he said that would basically lead to the end of food production. There'll be no more farming in the UK. It wouldn't be possible. So that's a really serious risk. I mean, we had other people talking about how, we're already seeing the impact on food. We had in the UK, they've had sort of 3 of the worst harvests ever in the past decade. That's already hitting sort of food prices and contributing to the cost of living crisis. So there are all these reasons to be really afraid.
Yeah, no, I think, as you say, it wasn't anything that we New Scientists and involved in this stuff and reporting over the years were not aware of, but it was still very powerful to hear it packaged like this. And I think if it does this message and they are going to try and get it out as widely as possible, then hopefully it will shock more people. Although, I mean, maybe the idea is to shock people, to scare them.
Yeah, I think we seem to need that because not enough is happening. As I wrote about recently, we've seen 4 years where the predictions for how much warming there will be have not changed at all because there's been no effective action, no new sort of policies announced. And so we're heading for a very sort of serious future.
You mentioned Kevin Anderson of the University of Manchester. He spoke about what we need to do and to not be diverted by solutions that don't work, and in fact focus on the ones that we know do work. And here he is talking about that.
If we're serious about trying to deliver on our Paris commitments, and I would say this is now the weaker end of that, the 2 degree C framing, there are 2 absolute prerequisites. The first one is we need to deploy technologies as rapidly as we possibly can. But these are technologies that are not pseudo-technologies, not technologies for tomorrow. They're the ones we know how to do today. Retrofitting our houses, public transport, all of these things that are the non-sexy end of the technology we know how to do, and we can do it very quickly. I think a lot of the more exotic technologies are more of a delay tactic than they are a meaningful technologies to deliver on climate change. Remember, climate change, the most important element to understand is the time frame of response. That time frame takes me to the second prerequisite, is we've got to reduce the energy consumption amongst the relatively high emitters in our society who drive most of the emissions. And that's a large but still nevertheless minority group of relatively wealthy ones amongst us.
Now, one of the other speakers was Lieutenant General Richard Nugee, a retired former general from the British Army, with loads of experience around the world in different combat zones, basically. Now, he spoke about the threat of climate change to national security, and he said, and this is a general, it's not, like I said, it's not like a tree hugger type person, He said we're facing the possibility of an ungovernable state. And he mentioned Churchill in his presentation. Afterwards, I asked him a bit more about that. And he said Churchill called out the threat that we faced during at the start of the Second World War from Nazi Germany. He named the threat and he faced it. And here's Lieutenant General Nugee talking about that.
Churchill did two things. One is he called it out of government, very unpopular. People didn't trust him. He'd crossed the House 3 or 4 times or whatever it was. And yet he called it out time and time and time again. So that when the crisis really hit in 1940, you had an individual who was not moving from what he had said before he was in power, before he had the ability to actually change anything. He was turning around and saying, we need to persevere. The other thing he did is he had a constant belief, whether privately or not he did, he had an absolutely public constant belief that we could win, that we could do it, that we could provide hope for everybody, that even in the worst time of the Blitz, that actually we will get through this and we will survive and we will prevail. That sort of leadership is not there today. That sort of leadership is what's needed, where we can turn around and say there is a sunlit upland. We just have to focus and persevere. And the classic, it's going to get worse before it gets better, is probably true. But a leader who is prepared to stand up and say, I'll take the blows as long as I can deliver the outcome, is the sort of leader we need. And that's the sort of leader we had in the Second World War.
Who's our Churchill now? I mean, I didn't expect that we're to be naming Churchill in a segment on the climate crisis, but it was a powerfully made point, I thought.
The other thing that I really liked about the talks is that they really emphasize the connections between things. This is about the biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis, and those things are interconnected, and they also connected to our health, to our security, to our the economy. All these things are connected, and these connections can work in bad ways. So, for instance, we talked about food production. So when extreme weather hits food production, you get prices going up. That sort of impacts people. Impacts the economy. It can lead to sort of civil unrest. It can even lead to wars. People have talked about the connections with Syria and what happened there. But it can also work in good ways. For instance, there was some mention of rewilding and how, if you have sort of barren hills that are rewilded, then it's great for wildlife, but also more vegetation means water is retained for longer in the hills, and that reduces flood risks. Right. And so there are all sorts of positive benefits that sort of stack up, all sorts of good positive connections that you can call on when you start to act.
But we're really bad at making these connections though, aren't we? Because I'm thinking of COVID. Like, do you remember that there was this big debate about, well, do we prioritise the economy or health? And of course, economy is dependent on health. And so it's a similar thing here, where do we prioritise the economy or the future of everything?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And what one of the economists who spoke at the meeting, Angela Francis, she was sort of pointing out that if we'd done more ahead of Russia's attack on Ukraine, we would have saved so much money because, we'd have been paying less for gas. We would have been paying less for food because the cost of fertilizers shot up. I think she said 400% fertilizer prices went up 400% as a result of the war.
So multiple billions would be saving.
Yes. And so there are all these, if we'd done more earlier, we'd have been insulated ourselves from some of those sort of
that's more
effects.
on sort of climate preparedness would have protected us from the economic shock.
Exactly. But as the climate impacts ramp up, of course, then if we're not preparing for it, then those impacts get worse. And so you can say, we can't afford to act. But if you don't act, then the costs ramp up. The costs will be much worse down the line. So we don't have a choice. It's not we can sort of save money and act later. If we sort of don't spend the money now, then we're going to have less money to spend later, not more.
But a lot of people don't make that connection, because I think you've written about quite a lot for us. People don't think, well, my food is really expensive now, and blame climate change. People don't realise that that's a big part of the reason.
Exactly, and I think that's why it's so great that these connections really emphasised at this emergency briefing, and it's a message that needs to get across to people that farmers are being hit really hard by climate change. As I was talking about we've just seen floods affecting, the yields in the UK right around us. This is not some distant future. It's happening now. We're already seeing food prices go up because of climate change. And the people need to know that and know it's going to get a lot worse. The less we do, the worse it gets.
And another point that I took away from this is that the public actually support a lot more action than they're getting. And there's been some surveys done about this that shows that. So the people who lead a lot of political parties say one thing, and certain newspapers say one thing as well. But the people actually are pushing for much more change than that. And one of the experts at this event was Paul Behrens. He's a professor at Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford. And he spoke about food security. And I asked him about this public desire for action. And here he is.
What we see is people care a lot more about climate change and nature action than we think. And survey after survey shows this. So when we ask people, how much do you think other people care, we underestimate by about half. And that's astonishing. We see that around the world. So, for example, the support for policies like frequent flyer levies, where we increase the cost of each additional flight that you take, a little bit of a tax on top of each one. The support for that across the country is well over 70%. And even if we look at people who are voting for parties that might not talk about climate change, or in fact actively deny climate change, like, for example, Reform, what we see is above 70% of Reform intending to vote voters, they actually support or don't mind wind turbines on land, which is astonishing. I mean, I would never have guessed that.
There were lots of sort of famous faces there as well. I spoke to Mark Rylance, big hero. Jennifer Saunders was there, absolutely fabulous. And I noticed she had a notepad, and on it said absolutely fabulous, big letters. The fabulous was crossed out and it said absolutely I was hoping she would hold it up. However, there were we heard a lot of horrific futures that we are facing. But despite that, I felt it was really empowering, this event, to hear all these people talking about what we need to do.
No, it was great, as you say, having celebrities like that turn up and support this kind of event is great. And I came away with this sense of, all the people there sort of were understanding the problem and very keen to see more action. And, if the more of that we can have, the better it is. And it's just really encouraging to get together with people and see the sort of level of both the level of concern, but also the level of support for action and the eagerness for action to do stuff. And of course, the antidote to despair is action. We've got to get out there and do stuff.
And so if you do want to get involved, learn more about this, you can go to the site. It's nebriefing.org. There's a lot of information there. They themselves will be making films about this. They're working with faith leaders as well. This film is going to be played in thousands of churches across the country and other centres of faith. So it's going to just go out everywhere, and they give practical, science-led steps that governments need to take. And it is focused on the UK, but the same thing really applies globally.
That's all for this week. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to you for listening.
And we'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
If you've enjoyed today's episode and want to continue feeding your curiosity, then it's worth checking out our Black Friday sale, which has just gone live. Get 50% off our annual subscription price to New Scientist. Gain unlimited digital access to all our latest reporting and premium articles. available on our app, website and print. Visit newscientist.com/sale and unlock a deeper understanding of our world.